We are in a four-part message series called How to Neighbor. And today we are bouncing into Lonely Loved. In the past few weeks, we've hit several different subjects. And first week, we looked at how to reconcile races. And then we went to the empowering our orphans embraced. And last week, we went to empowering the poor. This week, as I mentioned, we're going into the lonely loved. And it's one of the biggest challenges. Loneliness is one of the biggest challenges for many of us today in our lives. And if it's a challenge for us, it's a challenge for others, and we just often don't realize it. When God created the heavens and the earth, He actually, if you read through the book of Genesis in the beginning of it, you see that God created things, and after He created every single thing, He continually, over and over, He said it was good. It was good. He created on the first day, it was good. The second day, it was good. Third day, it was good. And when He created man, He said it was very good. And then He came to something, though, that wasn't good. He said it's not good for man to be alone. In other words, we were never created to be alone, and God recognized, not only did He recognize, God designed it in each one of us that we should have someone in our lives, that we should have others in our lives, so that we are not alone. Because loneliness is not who we were created to be. The reality of how significant loneliness is and a struggle for many of us today is, if you look through the history of music, you can see how many songs were written about loneliness. And just the modern day, if you think of 1960 for the Elvis fans, Are You Lonesome Tonight? Anybody remember that song, right? It was a classic. It was way before my time. 1960, Roy Orbison was only the Lonely. And then there was a 1975, All by Myself by Eric Carmen. And 2010, Lady Antebellum said Need You Now, which was about loneliness. And then 2011, The Lonely by Christiana Perry. And it's so lonely, lonely, lonely. That Songfacts.com actually says there's 280 songs in the modern era that are written specifically about loneliness, because it's such a common challenge for a lot of us. And you can be with a lot of people and still feel lonely, can't you? You can be in a crowded church on a Sunday morning right here with people next to you in a row and still feel very lonely. You can be a stay-at-home mom, and you can have this deep sense of living in loneliness. And of course, if you're a mom who has toddlers hanging all over you all day long, and you just can't get away from them, you can't even go to the bathroom without them, and then your husband comes home and wants to hang on you, you'd just like to be lonely sometimes, wouldn't you? Some of you have been there before, right? But even with all of that, in a weird way, you can still be lonely. Still be lonely. You can work around a lot of people. You can feel like you're not close to anyone, even in the midst of all of that work and people around you. You're plagued with a sense of something more is missing in your life, that something is gone. You have many people around, but you don't feel like anyone cares about you or that you can open up to anyone that is around you. You don't feel like anyone really is there, even though you're speaking to someone at that moment. See, some of you are sitting here today in a crowd, but you're really living a life of loneliness. And you know it, and no one else really does. So 4 theories on why loneliness is so prevalent today and such a struggle with us today when we're a more connected world than ever in history of time. Number 1 is the breakdown of families has grown significantly over the last decades and generations, right? Families are split, and because of those family splits, it brings in an aspect of loneliness. A divorce happens, and what happens is someone's going to lose some friends, and someone's going to lose some friends, and even in the church, somebody's going to lose a church family if they're a part of a church in that couple, and someone's going to be left alone. Number 2, though, is the increased mobility that we exhibit today in our lives. People don't stay in one place very long. People don't stay in the same job or in the same home or in the same community even. We move around and around and around much more than we ever did in previous generations. We move to a new job and we get a new home and we get new neighbors, a new church and a new school. And from kindergarten all the way up, it's I don't know anybody and I am alone. And so it's because of the mobility. Number 3 is busy lives. Busy lives. It's amazing how busy we are, isn't it? We're all so busy all the time. How you doing this morning? Oh, I'm busy. How you doing these days? Oh, it's busy. Why are we so busy? We're so busy all the time, we don't connect with each other intimately anymore. We have work, we have Little League, we have dance, we have cheer, we have hockey, we have, and it just piles on top and on top and on top, and we're with people all the time, and we're totally lonely even with all of the busyness that we have. Some of you retired thinking that you would like some free time, but how many retirees I talk to that are so busy even? It's like, man, I just feel like I should have stayed at work. I wouldn't have had as much to do. Those are guys with wives, by the way, usually, right? Yeah. She's going to give you something to do no matter what. No, we are, though. We just have a hard time not being busy. So that's another reason. And a fourth reason, the rise of social media has really made us lonely, and that's so counterproductive to what it sounds like it should be. We get a glimpse of into someone's life on social media without having a relationship with them beyond a glimpse. And that's about as deep as it ever goes. We get to see everyone else's trophy while in our own life we know the trophy isn't there. So what we do is we go on and we compare everybody else's best stuff to our real life stuff, and as a result we assume they can't relate to us, so we never really move any closer to people because they wouldn't understand what's going on in our life. We don't feel like they could really accept us. Well, when we do that, we feel alone. We post a selfie, and then what happens when we post a selfie? We go back and we look to see if anybody liked it. And then we go, why didn't they like that? Well, maybe I need another one. Maybe I need one from a different angle, right? Because this one makes me look better. And then we go back to see, did anybody comment on it? And then when nobody fulfills all of what we try to do, we go, man, I just feel so alone. And psychologists are beginning to look at it and say that we're actually deferring loneliness on social media. We're deferring it until a later time. In other words, if I post it and everybody sees it and some people like it and things, well, at that moment I might feel like, wow, somebody really cares. But then when it's done, we feel lonely. We just feel lonely at a later time until it goes over and over and over in a cycle. So what does loneliness do in our lives? Loneliness in marriages leads to the affair. Loneliness in marriage leads to the affair. Loneliness in health leads to anxiety and fear. Loneliness leads to being alone. Even in a crowd, we're alone. So Jesus understood loneliness, though. And we may fail to think that God can relate to this or Jesus can relate to this, but Jesus understands loneliness. One time he heals a man early in his ministry, and he says to the man, make sure and see to it that you don't go tell anyone else about this. But then we come into Mark 1:45, and here's what happens. Instead, the man he healed, went out and began to talk freely, spreading the news. As a result, Jesus could no longer enter a town openly. Look at this. But stayed outside in lonely places. Yet the people still came to him from everywhere. It's a loneliness. Jesus had to separate himself from society as a result of people's demands. And some of you can relate. You separate yourself from society because of the demands that people put onto your life in a professional sense or otherwise. And it keeps you from engaging in personal relationships beyond the professional life because of the demands that are there. And as a result, you're lonely. Luke 5:15, it says, but Jesus often withdrew to what kind of places? Lonely places. And prayed. So when you think Jesus can't relate to where you are, you can bet that he can. One of the biggest struggles in my life, honestly, was for many, many years was a fear of loneliness and loneliness. I'd always had people around. Actually, in school, I was the athletic person, so I always had friends, and I was always around. But even in the midst of that, I had a real issue in my life with loneliness. And part of my struggle with, honestly, when I was alone, I didn't like who I was with. That's to be honest. And to be raised into a broken family is to be raised lonely. It's just a simple reality. And some of you know and joke, we joke a lot about my lack of affection for spiders. My lack of affection for spiders and my lack of affection for them is what used to be a major spider phobia for me, actually. And I don't so much anymore, but used to be they would almost send me into a panic attack kind of a thing. Spiders would, and it's like ridiculous, really, spiders? But yeah, I mean, it's one of those things where spiders could be in my home and I would give you my house. So you could get a good deal if you just plant them outside somewhere. You're good to go, right? But it's not so much anymore for me. But I had to learn, what was it about? What is this dilemma? Because it wasn't a fear thing that was really there for me. And then I realized something. I realized that this fear or this phobia about spiders developed in my life in a time in my life growing up when our family was in turmoil. It was a split family. Life was chaotic. It was uncertain. It was undependable. And life was in ruins in our family so often. And at that time, life was highly unstable, and I was living with a parent in a home that was infested with, you'll never guess what? Spiders. And one night I realized, we're talking like maybe a little more than a decade ago is all. I realized through some chain of events, I realized that for me, there's real loneliness in the spiders. And began to understand that that's really what it was about in my life. It was loneliness. See, loneliness can be about being alone, but it is more about being hurt. It is more about fear in life of being alone. We saw a scripture a couple weeks ago about adoption, and in Psalm 68:6, it says, God sets the lonely in families. He leads out the prisoners with singing, but the rebellious live in a sun-scorched land. But look at that first part. He sets the lonely in families. And while that certainly applies to children and the adoption and care for children in their times of lonely, we have to realize it expands much beyond that to be a significant need in life. God sets the lonely. He sets the lonely in families. That means adults too. That means seniors, that means young adults, it means kids, it means everything. He sets lonely in families. For our entire life, adult life, Joyce and I have largely been suburbanites. Now, suburbanites are different in that they usually don't live where they're from. A good percentage of them. They move to a location because of a job or career path that they're on, and so they move to a place where they don't know people. It's not where their family's from. And so when I was 19, I moved from the little small town that I grew in of about 1,000 people in a farming community that I grew up in there to a slightly larger town called St. Louis. You know, from like 1,000 to 1 million plus. A little bit of a jump in life. So we've been suburbanites from that age on. And so Joyce and I, we've moved around over time, and we aren't originally from any place that we've lived since we've been adults. Suburbanites move around, and we moved around so much. We've lived in 4 different communities in our adult life with 2+ hours in between every single one of those communities that we've lived in, and we've lived in about 8 homes, I think, in that time span of almost 30 years. In my whole life, I've lived in somewhere around 14 plus homes growing up. So moved around a lot, and I hate moving. Now, I think I've got a moving phobia now that I think about this, right? All of us don't care for it. But what that means is each time that somebody moves, a suburbanite moves, much as many of you are, you move to a new physical location, a new physical place with new physical neighbors, and often even a new physical church, and often also new physical relationships that don't exist. So in general, to be a suburbanite is to kind of have to restart life all the time for many, many people. But regardless of where the need comes from, all of us are in need of God's love in our life, and God uses other Christians, other people to bring that love into our lives so that we know what it's like to know His fullness in our lives. So we're going to give 2 foundational keys here to loving the lonely. 1, setting the lonely in families requires looking for the lonely to love. Setting the lonely in families means looking for the lonely to love. You've got to look. They're around you everywhere. You've got to look, though. God calls us to open our eyes to recognize that there are other people in our lives or around us that have needs that need to be met, and you are His shining light in their life to meet those needs. Now, I'll tell you, the first time Joyce and I had the opportunity to really set the lonely or see the lonely in families is accidental. Total accidental. Accidental because we had kids. We had kids. We had two neighbors, next door neighbors to us that were middle-aged and unable to have children or never had children. And so by us having children, they quickly became the adoptive grandparents to our kids. Our kids were there all the time. I mean, they just loved going to their house right next door. Why is it that our kids like to go to somebody else's house, even if it's only 20 or 30 feet instead of our home? Right? It's the weird thing, right? But they would love go there. They would spend hours over there. They just thought it was great over there. And we've kept in touch with them. We lived next to them for 10 plus years, and we've kept in touch with them. Each year we try to see them. And throughout growing up, they bought our kids Christmas presents and spent more on our kids for Christmas very often than we did, because they just thought the world of our kids and love our two boys. And we would pray for them every night. And part of praying for them was that we would pray. The husband had a challenge with drinking excess every evening, and so we would pray every night, and we'd kneel with the boys and pray, and then the very end of the prayer, the end of the prayer, the boys would say was, and please help Harold stop drinking all that beer. Every night, even after we moved, it was, and please help Harold stop drinking all that beer. And it was adorable and cute, but it was prayer, and it was real. And sure enough, years later, we just got a call. We're talking somewhere, and it was, this has been since we've moved here, and we've been gone from there for several years. Got a call one time, and just through the conversation, it's like, oh, Harold quit drinking, by the way. Oh, really? Isn't that amazing? Wonder why? Because some little boys prayed for years, and please help Harold stop drinking all that beer. And the lonely became our family in so many ways. It's purely by accident. But I found since then that God calls us to that. He calls us to keep our eyes open, to look for the lonely to be loved. A couple separates, as I mentioned before, and they separate not just their lives, but they separate their relationships, and they divide in their lives, and the loss that they experience reaches far beyond each other. They lose those friendships. They lose love and support of one another. The couple used to have friends that had children, and now their children have also lost friends. And the children are lonely, no longer see each other. One of the spouses will lose a church, and the other will lose spiritual support, and there's a lonely couple. There are lonely people that need you to be the family that God sets them in to be loved. There are new people in your neighborhood that doesn't know anyone. They don't know anybody, and they are in need of a place for God to set them. There are single people that your family can be the family that God sets them in. There are people who've moved into your community that can be the people that God sets them in. There are people who've moved from outside the country that have come here and need your family to be people that God sets them in. Some of our dearest friends, Joyce and I, have been neighbors for several years that came from another country and came here knowing no one. And they have been special to us, and their kids that were born while they lived right across and down the way from us. They call us Uncle Eric and Aunt Joyce, and they just moved a couple weeks ago to another city, and hate to see them go, but they gave us a glimpse of the joy of another culture, and we learned as much, I think, from them as they learned from us, because God opened that door. You see, you are the presence of God to the lonely in need of love. You are the presence of God. So at one time on our street, it's a wonderful neighborhood and street, but one time on our street, we had 3 ministers that lived with just in a few houses of each other. I mean, literally like a triangle. That's kind of weird, I know. And it was unplanned. And so Joyce and I, neighbors, would move in, and we would knock on doors to a new neighbor and take them a little plate of cookies. And little did I know, it took me a little bit to recognize this, but the builder knew I was a minister, so he's telling all the new neighbors. And so I'd knock on the door, "Hi, we're Joyce and Eric." And they're like, "Are you the minister that lives on the street?" "Yeah, don't I have any other definition or anything, But it was one of those, and I always love to say, I'm one of them. One, it's 3. If atheists moved on our street and they learned there's 3, it's kind of almost like maybe there is a hell. There's 3 of these guys. It's just not right. But still the opportunity, but two of us have lived across the street from each other for the last 10 years since we've been here, and we talk regularly, and we're good friends, and we get a chance to go to lunch every once in a while, but that's quite rare, honestly. Quite rare to have somebody that close to you in your vocation. And today, did you know that ministers largely, when they survey ministers, that the highest percentage of ministers and their spouses say that one of their challenges of life is being lonely? Do you know that? Now, I don't say that to say, oh, we're all lonely here. I say that to show that it illustrates that the lonely can be people you would have no idea about. They could be the guy across the street from you that shines his beautiful supercar day and night out there and looks beautiful and seems like everything's organized in order. And in reality, he's doing it because he's empty in life. They can be the super go-getter person, you know, the mom that just seems to accomplish everything. I mean, she runs the kids to every event in the world. She's busy. She's the pinnacle of the one who gets the trophy for just being the greatest mom in the world, but she's doing it because she's empty inside. And she needs somebody to move into her loneliness. Maybe it's somebody with a career that just drives them because they're just in need. So, to find them, God calls us and requires us to look for them. You got to look for them. You got to keep your eyes open. It requires you praying, God, show me the lonely that need to be loved through your love. It may be that person that you just never thought of, but regardless of it, setting the lonely in families means looking for the lonely. And second one, loving lonely requires including them in your life. It requires including them in your life. It takes effort. It takes effort to crawl out of your own busyness. It takes making loving others an intentional part of who you are and what you're about and what your faith is about and what you're called to do. It takes being willing to be inconvenienced because sometimes it's inconvenient. It's humorous how many times you find when you open that door, how many times people will ask you to do things that are really inconvenient to you, but it's great. You didn't realize they were going to be good opportunities. Pick a person this year. Pick a person, pick a couple, pick somebody this year. Pray for God to open your eyes to see them. Pick somebody who's lonely and decide that you're going to commit to pray for them daily. Commit to seeking ways to include them in your family and into your life. Pick a person that you're going to connect with in this year. Loving the lonely requires including them in your life. King David, he's the king. He's the king of Israel, and he's got unbelievable power politically. He's a man after God's own heart. God calls him that. I mean, this is a guy that writes a big bulk of the Psalms because of his artistic abilities. He's got armies. He's got everything. But then he comes along in Psalms 25:16, and he writes this: "Turn to me and be gracious to me, for I am" what? Lonely. He's got it all. He lives in a castle. But I'm lonely. I'm lonely. Turn to me, God. God's the ultimate filler. God is the ultimate filler of our loneliness. And you are the filler that God will often use. God calls us to reach out to the lonely because that's how he reached out to you and me. You see, some of us are here today and loneliness is tearing you up inside. It's consumed you, and you're in need of God to fill that loneliness with his presence. And it may very well come, and often does come, through filling you with other people's presence through him. Only God can truly fill your loneliness, but he's going to use others to do it. How to neighbor means lonely or loved. It means lonely or loved. Lonely means you are loved. Some of you, it can span all ages. I've had several over the years that have told me how you've lost a spouse here and how you've felt detracted, like you couldn't come to church. You just didn't feel like you belonged anymore even. Some of you relate to that, I know. And then I've had several also tell me how someone else at church has grabbed a hold of you and just drawn you in and said, hey, come to our small group. And you said, I really didn't want to, but I went and it's what I needed. See, loneliness spans from birth to the grave because it's only in heaven that we are no longer really ever alone. So what is God doing in your life today? If you're lonely, Jesus understands it. If you're lonely, He wants to fill it. He understands your emptiness. He wants to fill it with His presence, and that starts by Him filling it with His salvation. Because above all, God understands loneliness because Jesus was lonely at one specific time in His life more than any other, and it was the cross. Recognize that? It was the cross. He was lonely on the cross. It actually says in the Gospels that Jesus, not only did Jesus had all these followers, you would think He never had any challenges, right? But when they arrested Him, they all scattered. All of His believers, all of His followers, everybody scattered. They were nowhere to be found. And He went to the cross alone. And on the cross, He says, my God, why have you forsaken me? Why have you left me? Why have you left me alone? And He did that for you. Jesus was alone so you never have to be alone again in your life without His presence filling you and leading you and speaking to you and showing you the joy of His love and grace that lasts for eternity.